Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns, the Anti-Federalist. Yes, they did. They got it right. Here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where, yes, it does. Liberty does work for you. And today I'm going to kind of start out with is that, you know, folks, I'd really like you to go check out the rest of the hosts and hostesses at Liberty Works Radio Network. Go see what other programming's there. And definitely, I'd like you to take the time to find the value in the programming and contribute. This is a listener-funded network, and it is all about you. And it just needs your help. Now, a couple of things that I think this week are interesting. Always so many things. If you're alive, if you breathe, if you have any sense of day and night, if you have to travel somewhere, so much going on. So much going on in our lives. The information overload, that which is on all the various forms of media, that which is, you know, where people are so consumed by the internet, and all the various places there, from the Twitters to the Facebooks to every other news source that's available. We do have that information overload. Couple of things in regards to that, from having had some work that I did in a high-performance computing environment. One item that came out a few weeks ago was that there's a gentleman by the name, I'm not going to get into details, but there was a gentleman that left one of the large corporations that runs a lot of the media and the internet stuff, if you will. He decided that all of the work that he has been doing in artificial intelligence, that it was incumbent upon him to take and create the artificial intelligence God, because people are looking for God, and that artificial intelligence would be the answer for that. Well, you know, I don't know about you, but, you know, I am old enough to have watched 2001 Space Odyssey, or 2010 or whatever it was, 2000-something Space Odyssey, where good old Hal, the computer, all of a sudden becomes so self-actualized that, you know, he takes over or, you know, is assumed that greater role. Geez, isn't that interesting? And what became more interesting is that as I was going through my daily studies and I happened to be in Genesis this past week in particular, I was reminded in reading about the Tower of Babel what happens when somebody takes and tries to create and go to the heavens, if you will. Well, that takes us even to a very interesting perspective, is that out of you can look out of Genesis and just a creation environment that happened. It becomes that the fall of mankind is the idea of the knowledge of good and evil, and to the extent what that means then is that, wow, you have a capacity to be like God. Or the goal of the devil was always that mankind would become like God in its whole essence. So this far-fetched dream of this guy becomes extremely interesting when we look at that. You're going, Tom, why are you going down this path? You know, what's that got to do with anything around the Anti-Federalists getting it right and Founder's intent, and what you promised us from last week to pick up on Benjamin Rush's letter, or actually he didn't call it a treatise, I do, but it was just this long explanation of education. Well, a number of things. I can't say just two, because, you know, I'll go down every rabbit hole that I possibly can. The idea that you, me, or especially those that do not understand the biblical truths in their whole context, the idea is that you're self-determining. And if you do not submit to that higher truth of God's existence and what he means, and then the salvation message that he made, because he made that promise back in Genesis to Adam and Eve about the serpent's head being crushed, and he gave then a way as to what is salvation and what does that mean from his perspective, and then that develops over the course of history. That what we have then is what the folly of man, and how we, in the idea of self-determination, all of a sudden are taking and making these tyrannical and dictatorial solutions for other. And even within the framework of something that was put together for an idea of governance, a framework for governance, like Constitution of the United States, you can see from the anti-federalist perspective that tyranny and despotism, usurpation, all of those terms that were used both in the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers have a place that plays out in human history when one does not refer back to the basic fundamentals of a personal acknowledgement of who God is, who Jesus Christ is, and how that fits into the greater societal environment. I came upon a very interesting video this past week by Doug Wilson, whom I know Doug. A lot of you folks, I don't know him as well that I did, 40 years ago, per se, but what Doug's accomplished are many very interesting and good things. But this video is Doug Wilson on what pound American cultures. It is done by the Culture in Harmony project, and I thought it was very interesting where Doug was talking about that perspective of American culture, slavery, race, Christianity, and its respect here within the current liberal American perspective, as well as he actually answered some additional things for folks as to, what does that mean for the rest of the world. Now, when we take that, and the link is there, as you well know, so the link is both in the promo, the Facebook page, as well as on the YouTube video. The link is there to what Doug had to say. And I found that it was very complimentary to what Benjamin Rush was talking about in the thoughts upon the mode of education for a republic. What are those? What is that? And that, is the drawback from last week. And I'm not going to necessarily pick up in reading that this week, because I expect that you'll go and read it yourself. Yes, I'm sorry for those folks on Facebook. I do expect you to read, the references. Geez, simple stuff. But where I found this connection between what Doug was talking about and what Benjamin Rush is talking about is first that what we have seen, especially in the course of the latter portion of the early portion, mid portion of the 20th century, all through the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, those that would be called what do we want to call them? The the neocons, even some of the those that would be called the conservatives that have this globalist effect, is that this hegemony that they want over the rest of the world. Well, that's not what Benjamin Rush was talking about. Doug doesn't talk about that. That's not what the founder's intent was. And where we get into that is something here that Benjamin Rush was saying, is that, remember, last week I mentioned to you that he said that he would see other religious components, even that of Hindu or even Muhammad and all of that, that would bring that guideline and disciplinary perspective from a religious perspective into the America, if we didn't have Jesus Christ and if we didn't have Christianity. So from his perspective, and just as a review, is that the expected religion that leads to morality and virtue for America, and in particular, he hammers home, go back and look at last week, he hammers home that about republics. And one of the things that, I think that was very, very interesting that, Doug was talking about that has some parallels in here, not the exact, but has some parallels, is that we in America don't have number one, a right to go pushing our form of government and all of that all over the world, nor does the rest of the world have a right to push that on us, what their stuff is. Every culture is unique, and it has been designed by God unique in its environment. Now, what changes culture, and as I had a conversation with a pastor at the church that I attend, as well as then what Doug was talking about, what changes culture and what changed the American culture within the context of the Great Awakening, that first Great Awakening, is Jesus. Okay? And our culture today is void of that understanding of Jesus, to the extent that you have Antifa, to the extent that you have all of these other socialist, communist, liberals, isms, globalisms, all of that is so profound and taking apart what founders' original intent is, because I won't use the past anymore, because it's still valid, because it's on that continuum for what a constitutional republic should look like. So when we look that every culture is not to be an American culture, every culture should be of its own environment. Every culture has that right to exist and adopt those political systems, those frameworks of governance that are within that functionality for that culture. But I can guarantee you that when the whole totality from Genesis all the way through Revelations is captured in the minds, hearts, and souls of individuals, there becomes a cultural change, and then there becomes a political change. That is the essence of what Jesus says when he talks about setting us free. So when we're free from the essence and the peculiarities of slavery, I was thinking about it today, actually not just today, but earlier in the week, that my preference is that I am a slave. And my slavery is not to anything within the context of a governmental perspective. There are those that are slaves within their jobs, which I had conversations about this week, that are the modern feudalism, which you've heard me talk about before. But my preference is to be, which is constantly an effort, is to be a slave of Jesus Christ. Paul talks about that. What does that mean? Gosh, I'm not going to get into the theological aspects of it, but I'm not a very good slave. I fail all the time, and so I do have to be properly and righteously disciplined, if you will, and learn what it means to live within that environment. So, there are those types of things out there that, we can talk about the inhumanity of humanity upon one another. And we talk about that from what is the American context. What is it that we need to look at, once again, not just from the cultural aspect, but also from an educational perspective. And that's where I want to go more in depth with as we get into the next segments of Samuel Adams Returns. What it means to take in these thoughts upon the mode of education, for a republic that Benjamin Rush was talking about. And then how do we develop that, and what has more so impacted us, and we're going to talk about UNESCO, as we return once again in that Samuel Adams Returns, and those anti-federalists, they got it right. But you know what? in many ways, they supported the Federalists. So come on back in the next segment here at Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work for you. Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns the Anti-Federalists. Yes, they did. They got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty works for you. And yes, I forgot to tell you, if you didn't already know in that first segment, I got so excited about everything that was going on. Yeah, my name's Tom Navolis, and yes, I am. I am your host once again, and I'm so delighted that you're here with me. And, back to kind of figure out what are we talking about when we start thinking about, geez, Tom, you're weird. You want to be a slave to Jesus. You're talking about UNESCO. You're trying to figure out, what are we doing with this culture in America? Made some references to Doug Wilson and his video on culture and. Whoa, what's that? How does that fit then back into what we were talking about last week? And I said we needed to press into even deeper this week from Benjamin Rush. And, go read that link. I mean, it's a good read. It will surprise you, and that then will take us into the conversation about UNESCO and a couple of different references that are there for you. One is definitely Charlotte Iserbyt and her book, and one I'll find a link for you. I'm going to show it to you, so those that are going to watch the video, you'll see this. But this book was given to me by the author herself. Just a very amazing work, and it is all on UNESCO. Just basically 100%. It's called In the Presence of Our Enemies. So In the Presence of Our Enemies is just a phenomenal piece of work by Ellen McClay. And it is a history of the malignant effects in the American schools of the UN's UNESCO and its transformation of American society from the lips of those who did it. What Ellen is her author's name, has done is, this thing is so documented out to kazoo of over, 680 pages, if you will, of documented proof of the destruction of our educational system by UNESCO. So the points that President Trump is using to pull out of UNESCO are interesting. That's on a cultural perspective because of the perversion in the UN and the perversion in UNESCO in particular. But it also that UNESCO, we pulled out of it before. Ronald Reagan pulled out of it, and he pulled out of it because of mismanagement. And Charlotte Iserbyt was in the Department of Education under Reagan, and she was forced to leave because she was bringing out the truth as to how the UN and UNESCO was destroying our educational system. And we're going to try and touch on that as we move through this. But one of the things that I wanted to bring us back on relative to culture, relative to education, and all those different truths, and what was Benjamin Rush talking. Sorry, I'm pulling on my own as I move around. I'm pulling around on the string here. I feel like I'm leashed in today instead of what the headset's all about. Anyway, Benjamin Rush was talking about, and he was talking about, what we need to be educated in. And first off, he always ties it to the reality that we need to have religion as the format for education, and to the extent that that religion should only be for America. Okay, I'm going to qualify that, for the United States of America, should be Christianity and the teachings of Jesus and the Bible. Okay, so when he's talking about all of that, he comes down to this one segment and says, I do not wish our youth to educated with a single prejudice against any nation. Okay, exactly. We shouldn't be prejudiced against any nation. But we impose a task upon human nature repugnant alike to reason, revelation, and the ordinary dimensions of the human heart when we require him to embrace with equal affection the whole family of mankind. Wonderful. That's all great. But then he prefaces all of that, which is that a young man, when we look at this, he says, he must watch for the state as if liberties depended upon his vigilance alone. So looking at the state of Pennsylvania is what he was referring to, and then to the United States itself. He must love popularity, but he must despise it when set in competition with the dictates of his judgment or the real interests of his country. Gosh, that's interesting. He must love character and have a due sense of injuries, but he must be taught to appeal only to the laws of the state, to defend the one and punish the other. There's things here about that good and evil that I talked about in the first segment. How do we look at that? How do we have good judgment? How do we develop the character of people so that they can have good judgment within society and understand that what is the good value for our general society, that being the state, and not from a socialist communist perspective, but that from an understanding, as we talked about last week, of a republic. And what does that mean? And how does that develop? He must love family honor, but he must be taught that neither the rank nor antiquity of his ancestors can command respect without personal merit. You see, we have too much of that. We had too much of that. So, that was the aristocratic insanities that still happen in a number of different European countries, and even in the certain forms of other countries. But in America, it was like, we've seen that, all of these different family ties, and even, you have to look at the Kennedys handing down to one another all of their stuff, and even within their political realm. But no, he's saying what everything needs to tie back to is personal merit. What is it about an individual? He must avoid neutrality in all questions that divide the state, but he must shun the rage and acrimony of party spirit. And that's what we have too much of. We have this party spirit. We don't have that understanding of what it is to be within this constitutional republic and the constitutional republic of the various states. What does it mean for you as a citizen in your state to understand your constitution and the fact and reality that you live in a republic? And then what does that mean from that greater idea of living within a republic? It's not that which Hamilton and just less than a handful of others wanted during the Convention of '87. They wanted a consolidated government, do away with the states, and have the federal government be the et-al over everybody. That's not what America is. America is not a well, it is today, I take that back, based on how it operates, but that's not what the founders intended. It was intended to be that union of independent states that reserved the majority of their power, and the people reserved all of their power, but were willing to give some of the states' power and authority to the federal government in a limited format. So it was never intended to impose all the nonsense, like healthcare nonsense, upon the people. So that's where the federal government is obviating state authority. But, without that, I'll just keep going. So he must be taught to love his fellow creatures in every part of the world, but he must cherish with a more intense and peculiar affection the citizens of Pennsylvania and of the United States. It's called patriotism. one of the things that we really don't look at is, what does it mean to live in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, New York, any of the states, from that particular perspective that I'm an Ohioan now. Well, I was born an Ohioan, but I traveled, and when I lived in Washington, I was a Washingtonian. Then I should be proud to be a Washingtonian, and then a citizen of the United States. But first, now, I'm an Ohioan. And guess what? I want to be proud to be an Ohioan. So when we start looking at what all of that means, and we go back then into what it is that he talks about, and that he doesn't want to be prejudiced against any notion of those various ideas of other nations, it's critical that then he also takes and he looks at, what does it mean to be a person that is first and foremost wholly dedicated also to his own family, and that family in the context of what does it mean to be a patriot, and what does that mean then to hold his firm prejudice to here in the United States of America. Let's think and ponder on that, just for a moment. As we take and continue to ponder that, and we have to ponder that, is that when we look at what he's talking about here, he goes on and he talks about that it's a formation and a love of our own country. And that's what we have to have. And our educational system has not done that. And worse is that UNESCO planned it. UNESCO clearly is a component that we're going to get into in this last segment, that its full intent is to destroy American education and the whole idea of who we are, and make it in such a manner that we have all of these destructive elements to take what? Undermine what our republic is. Undermine our founders' intent for constitutionalism and a constitutional republic. And worse, it's designed, UNESCO, let me clarify, UNESCO is designed to take and undermine our religious fabric. Our religious fabric is intended to be destroyed by UNESCO. I know that sounds pretty harsh, Tom. You're pretty harsh on all of that. Yeah, because it's well documented. So I'm not just talking, conspiracy theory or harshness or anything like that. I'm telling you fact. So anyway, as we get closer to the end here of this segment, is that some of the things that I'll just continue with what Benjamin Rush was talking about, is that he must be indulged occasionally in amusements, but he must be taught that study and business should be his personal and principal pursuits in life. Above all, he must love life and endeavor to acquire as many as the convenience as possible by industry and economy, but he must be taught that this life is not his own, when the safety of this country requires it. These are practical lessons, and the history of the commonwealths of Greece and Rome show that human nature, without the aids of Christianity, has attained these degrees of perfection. Okay? While we inculcate these republican duties upon our pupil, we must not neglect at the same time to inspire him with republican principles. Ladies and gentlemen, what it comes down to is that we have to do what I talked about weeks ago when I was looking at the University of Virginia getting me a piece of paper over there, is the idea of being inculcated. And that's what we do when we educate. So we have to assist in the rendering religious, moral, and political instructions more effectual upon the minds of our youth. It would be necessary that their bodies are also physically disciplined. There's a lot more that he goes into. This segment, what we want to finish with before we get into UNESCO in the last segment, is that number one, We are to look at all those other cultures. We're to look at all of those other things. We're supposed to talk about them, respect them, and to have an idea about them. But more so, more importantly, we are supposed to understand what it means to be people within this constitutional republic, and to the extent that the only way that a republican form of government can stand is by understanding morality and virtue, which can only come from Christianity. Okay? And Benjamin Rush is very specific about that. You have to understand those principles and truths that are from Jesus Christ. And that, we don't own ourselves to a certain extent. Yeah, we should be those honoring people of our state, and then also, to the extent that our national government calls us. But first of all, what does it mean from our locality? There's nothing, that's all what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be Ohioans, Washingtonians, Pennsylvaniaites, or whatever you want to call or how it goes. But what you really want to do is come back, because Samuel Adams has returned. And you got to remember, those anti-federalists, those anti-federalists did. They absolutely got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this final segment for today on Samuel Adams Returns. The Anti-Federalists got it right, and this is Tom Navulis, your host. And again, I'm delighted to be here with you and you with me, and there's just so much to cover. Always. I just never have enough time to get through everything I want to get through. And I may, depends on what rabbit hole I go down during the rest of this week, and trying to reflect upon those mirrors of history and make them understandable for today and what's going on. One of the things that you will read, and I think this is part that you may get to, that I find very interesting, if you haven't found anything else interesting about Benjamin Rush's treatise, is this section where he talks about amusements, where he talks about the arts. Now, none of that is in the media right now, where, we just have no concept of everything that's going on with that. Well, interestingly enough, that does have a tie into with UNESCO, and very interestingly, it was always talked about by a lot of the First Great Awakening and all of others, because quite frankly, Sam Adams talked about it too, and to the extent that it was Lord North that was saying that if they could bring the frivolity of the continent into the colonies in America, that people would forget about their liberty. So, wow, that's pretty interesting. So if you bring in all of the theater and the frivolity and the amusement of the theater into the colonies in America, you will forget about your liberty. Gosh, that happens so much, not just in movies and all of that, but, also, let's see, something like football and all of that. I don't know. Anyway, you can take it wherever you want to take it. But the reality is that it was talked about. And just to cover it quickly, because I do want to get to the UNESCO information, is that something that Ben Rush was writing here, I'll just read it real quick, is that I have hitherto said nothing of amusements that are proper for young people in a republic. Those which promote health and good humor will have a happy effect upon morals and government. To increase this influence, let the persons who direct these amusements be admitted into good company and subjected by the means to restraints in behavior and moral conduct. Taverns, which in most countries are exposed to riot and vice, in Connecticut are places of business and innocent pleasure, because the tavern keepers in that country are generally men of sober and respectable character. Wow, that's pretty interesting. That's why we saw through all of New England, where do they meet often? Were at taverns. It was not a place of drunkards and some of the things you think of taverns nowadays. It was actually a very reputable place to go. Then he goes, the theater will never be perfectly reformed till players are treated with the same respect as persons of other ornamental professions. It is to no purpose to attempt to write or preach down an amusement which seizes so forcibly upon all powers of the mind. Okay, get it. And remember, I talked about that the revolution was not the war. The revolution was what happened in our minds. So here you have the theater, if you will, that has that power of the mind. Let ministers preach to players instead of against them. Let them open their churches and the ordinances of religion to them and their families, and I am persuaded we shall soon see such a reformation in the theater as can never be effected by all the means that have hitherto been employed for that purpose. It is possible to render the stage by these means subservient to the purposes of virtue and even religion. Wow. Why should the ministers of the gospel exclude the player from his visits or from his public or private instructions? The author of Christianity knew no difference in the occupations of men. He ate and drank daily with publicans and sinners. So as we're looking, and especially those who call themselves Christians, as we're looking at the utter moral insanities, evils, sins, and destructions within the theatrical environment in total. Hollywood is only a component of that, but we know that as you go through and you look at all of it, whether it's dance, whether it's the stage, whether it's movies, wherever it is that everything that is contrary to our moral viability and virtue for the continuation of our republic is really got major moral problems. And it's incumbent upon us to go back and reflect and review what Benjamin Rush was talking about. So let me go through now and jump briefly, because we're never going to get through the end of this. There's so much to it. Because Charlotte Iserbyt's book, as well as, gosh, I don't know, what's Charlotte's book? I have to look here. Dumbing Down of America. It's a new revision. It also is over 700 and some odd pages, heavily documented. But where I wanted to start today is I wanted to start with in the classroom with children under 13 years of age towards world understanding, number 5. UNESCO publication 356. And this was, oh gosh, I can't remember the date of it. But you know what? I just want to lay out the table of contents for this document. So you have an introduction. You have section 1, the problem in general. So here's your problem, okay? Toward education of world-mindedness. Gosh. The teaching of geography. The teaching of history. The teaching of foreign languages. Section 2, the crux of the problem. The education of the critical sense. The feelings of belonging to humanity, values common in mankind, obstacles outside of the church, school rather, outside the school. And then it goes into all of these different aspects of how UNESCO, from a world perspective and teaching all this world stuff, is supposed to fix all the ills of the world. Well, you know, the problem, as we've already notified, and I think we need to look back to Benjamin Rush for our guidance on this, is that the reality is, you know, you need to look at all these other cultures, you need to look at all these other things in the world, but you better understand, and this goes back to the 1825 board of directors from the University of Virginia, is that we need to be inculcated in American ideas, principles, truths, values, everything within our state, as Benjamin Rush is talking about, and then in our federal government, our federal understanding of us as we, the people in America. Okay? extremely interesting. So let's get to some of the things that I looked at, and I just did a search inside and all the stuff I found just in Charlotte Iserbyt's book on Dumbing Down of America. One of the things that I forgot about in the preface is that, did you know that these ISO standards, ISO 9000, is in UNESCO? Wow. Did you know that the the ISO standards on human resources, ISO standard 1400, is from UNESCO? Whoa, wait a minute. Yeah, UNESCO is what developed that. The bureaucracy. Here's the thing that's very, very interesting to understand about UNESCO. Who was the first president, the first chancellor, if you will, the first head of UNESCO? You got it? Did you were able to snap that answer right out, right? No. It's hard to understand unless you get into this. It is Sir Julian Huxley. Okay, Sir Julian Huxley. And Huxley is one of the domineering forces in humanism at a minimum. Okay, he was a Fabian socialist that then determined and spoke of on grabbing children from their families to educate them in a societal box void of God, tearing apart the family concept, the family ideas, and training them in methods and theories of evolution and Pavlov and all of these other things that then has led to outcome-based education and the modern feudalism of, what's that thing called? Yes, that educational thing we have right now. Hey, Kath. I see you over there. What's that called, this education? Common Core. That's it. You got it. Common Core. So this is all part of that out of UNESCO. And then you go through and you look at all the different things that UNESCO did. And then what happened is that that UNESCO set forth what then would become the attacks on the Judeo-Christian traditions and Roman law. Legislation authorizing United States members in UNESCO marked the end of the United States autonomy in a very critical area, that of education. From this time on, UNESCO would dictate educational policy to our government. And you have to understand, this goes to what I talk about in The Tale of Two Constitutions, tyranny. The textbook on tyranny from covenant to the present Constitution. This is all under treaty. And if you remember, under which article is that? Yes, I'll let you go look. I'll let you go look up Article 6 and understand that under treaty becomes what? Treaty becomes part of the supreme law of the United States. So when we look at what we have to do under these educational components, I just, I have to tell you, is that both Charlotte and also right here, as I'm pointing it out for those on the camera, those on the radio can't see this, but In the Presence of Our Enemies by Ellen McClay, get into showing that how the treaty components that we signed and grabbed onto under UNESCO are being implemented 100% within our education, have been since 1948 within our educational system. I mean, you had different things that were happening with what's his name here? I'm looking at Truman. What they implemented. When you start going into the preface of UNESCO, starts its work by a Richard Johnson, and you start digging into all of these components that then take, and I'm telling you, it gets into all of the testing, what's demanded, what needs to be implemented from all of this testing insanities and everything. You can go through and look at both of these works, is Dumbing Down of America by Charlotte Iserbyt, and there's a new revision out there that I suggest you go out and get, as well as In the Presence of Our Enemies by Ellen McClay. And I'll have the references to these available for you. And the key component is that we are operating once again from a treaty perspective. So because, Donald Trump, first off, I can't even get into all of that it wasn't Ronald Reagan got us out of UNESCO for mismanagement and all of that. But what Donald Trump is doing is from that cultural aspect of what's happening with Israel and what the Arab nations are pushing through on that cultural perspective. And not only that, all the land we lost as these global heritage sites. I'm telling you, UNESCO is one of the most insidious components that then drives within the swamp and the swamp monsters in Washington, D.C. So what's your action items? Read and study. Go watch the video that I put up from Doug, and then go read Benjamin Rush, and then get a hold of Dumbing Down of America. There is a PDF, but I suggest go buy the revision and get a hold of, all of a sudden I just laid on you about 1,500, 2,000 pages of reading. I'm sorry, but you have to understand this so that you understand why Samuel Adams is coming back, has come back. And the Anti-Federalists got it right because they warned us of all of this. And thanks for being here with me, Tom Neville, your host, on Sam Adams. Yeah, he came back, the Anti-Federalists got it right, and we're here on Liberty Works Radio Network.